Just briefly on the NDP, I want to take you back to like 2004 period onward. You will know that we're still in the liberation movement. Some of us that time, we used to be members of the ANC. The dominant rhetoric that time was that poverty will be halved by 2014. 30% of land will have been redistributed by 2014. The mining charter objectives of 26% black ownership or historically disadvantaged ownership and would have been reached by 2014. And now, when it was apparent that none of those could be achieved by 2014, what did the government do? It shifted the goalposts to 2030 to say, let us achieve everything else in 2030. And that is why the National Development Plan is called the National Development Plan Vision 2030, is to shift the goalpost on more or less the same objectives that were set far much earlier. To say, no, now let us think that we're going to even create 11 million jobs by 2030 and would have industrialized, would have achieved this and that and everything else. If you pay detailed attention to the ideological underpinnings of the NDP and what was policy of government prior to that, the gear, the accelerated growth on like for South Africa, the ASGISA, it's not fundamentally different in terms of what it seeks to achieve and the methods that are being employed to achieve those objectives. I don't think you must be hoodwinked as civil society to believe that the NDP represents a different framework of where we can go. Now, speaking about corruption, there are two forms which we can talk to of corruption. One is with regards to government-related corruption, which is inherent in the current design of the state. It's inevitable to have massive corruption of bribes, and because the state is incapable. The South African government and state are incapable to do anything. They have to rely on private providers to supply them with even pens, with stationery. They can't send someone from the office to go and buy stationery. There must be a tender for stationery. There must be tender for food. There must be tender for paper. There must be tender to build bridges. There must be tender to build houses. There must be tender for everything. And what happens when you've got tenders and contracts for each and everything else? Those who are competing for tenders, they use money to give public officials in order to get the tender. That is why in local government, in provincial government, in national government, most of the resources are directed to the pockets of politicians and of public servants. That is what happens. That is what you're confronted with. The levels of bribery are possibly at 90%. Almost all tenders that are issued by the state, someone has to pay a bribery to a public official to get that tender. It's a reality, and that is the manner in which it has been approached. The NDP does not propose anything different to that. It is only the EFF in one of the founding cardinal pillars that says that we need to build state capacity where the government and state will be able to deliver its own services. Instead of having to issue a tender to close a pothole, you'll have to deal with that in a much more different way. Now, the second component which I want to talk to is grand-scale corruption, which is committed by the private sector, by the multinational corporations which are existing in South Africa, particularly in the mining sector, mainly because of lack of adequate legislation to monitor that. In almost all multinational corporations in South Africa, they avoid taxes by creating subsidiary companies in outside parts of the world, in the countries called tax havens. And then they sell goods and services to themselves. They overbloat the overheads. They bloat their overheads and so that they can avoid taxes in South Africa. And in terms of the scientific research, South Africa has lost billions of rands, actually trillions of rands over the past 10 years to such kind of corruption. But because we have got an incapable state which is indebted to mining capital, it's unable to deal with that much more decisively. And we have brought all evidence to Parliament, to all, to SARS, to anyone, to the Reserve Bank, that here's evidence. The Reserve Bank even confirms that these billions of rands which are being shifted by the multinational corporations, but nothing is being done. There has to be decisive action in terms of how we move forward. And the NDP, by the way, is not a solution on how we move forward. And what does the ANC do with all these things? It criminalizes institutions that deal with corruption decisively. There was corruption in Nkandla, it's a reality. The public protector found that the president unduly benefited from the illegal construction of Nkandla House. And what happens when the public protector goes to Parliament? ANC members of Parliament gang up against her and the office and even refuse to give additional resources for the public protector's office to deal with corruption. Because the reality of the matter is that all these other institutions that exist are not dealing with corruption in a decisive way which inspires public confidence. Majority of the cases that are in the courts to deal with corruption, they get delayed and postponement after postponement. There is no clarity of what is happening. The Public Service Commission, all these other ones are not capable. The public protector is inspiring public confidence in the country about dealing with corruption, but what does the ANC do? It vilifies the public protector's office and demolishes it and wants to mobilize society against an institution that deals with corruption. But you must never be misled that the NDP is a solution. It's not.